Good morning.
Good morning.
It's my distinct honor and privilege to be with you here today to share a few brief reflections upon the issue of mass incarceration, a phenomenon which this video has nicely illustrated as something which has frayed the social fabric of North American society and has often wreaked havoc upon its most vulnerable and impoverished communities. Now, before we delve into this topic, let's just admit that we are addressing a sensitive issue. And I have no doubt that there is a wide assortment of experience encompassed within this room, which will inform our conversations today. Now, my brief thoughts sprout from a similar kind of vantage point, which undoubtedly will reflect unfortunate blind spots and limitations. Where those limitations become manifest, I pray that you will not spare me the benefit of your indignation. After all, true Christian koinonia is not the same thing as being nice. With that preliminary word on the way, let's turn to the substance of the talk. The video this morning, as well as Cliff's very moving presentation last week, has already introduced the problem to us, statistically, personally, and conceptually, and I will take much of what has been said already for granted. That is, that there has been an exponential growth in the incarceration rate in North America, and that this isn't really mentioned on the video, at least I didn't catch it, although Cliff touched it last week, that this exponential growth has heavily been disproportionately focused upon particular ethnic and demographic groups. Our particular task today, though, is to think about this issue biblically and theologically, which is why I've entitled the talk, Mass Incarceration and the Christian Moral Imagination. Let me focus our time with a question. And the question is, what is it theologically that proves to be most obstructive when it comes to Christians failing to recognize this problem and to engage it? What theological or moral framework would need to be in place for a Christian individual to look upon these harsh, brutal realities and to fail to perceive the depth of the social crisis that surrounds us? My answer to those two questions, which I will develop briefly this morning, is that conventional ways of thinking about this, at least among some Christians, exhibit an anemic moral imagination. That is, a moral imagination that is in some important respects underdeveloped. This anemia surfaces especially in the assumptions about freedom and moral agency that seem to inform many sectors of the contemporary conversation. Now, it's customary for the idea of freedom or moral agency to be parsed into two basic concepts. We are all aware that freedom and moral agency in the first place have a subject. That is to say, we are each of us individual acting subjects. We make choices, we form values, and we enact priorities. Lots of issues in ethics are bound up with the subject of freedom. That is, the individual person who is the source of moral agency. In addition to the subject of freedom, the first half of the typical binary, we are also generally clear on the fact that freedom and moral agency can be constrained by external limits. For instance, my ability to make choices, to form values, to enact priorities can be hijacked if someone who is more powerful than I am imposes a restriction upon my acting. This restriction may come in a variety of forms: unjust laws, physical coercion, intentional oppression, or emotional assault. These two axes, that is the subject of freedom and the external limits of freedom, tend to be the predominant filters in and through which we process moral questions in public discourse. Now, these axes are both helpful and correct so far as they go, but they fail us if they are viewed as exhaustive categories. On their own, they are an anemic moral grammar. This should be clear to us when we see what happens when the simplistic binary is applied to mass incarceration. The first question that we will ask if we're operating with this anemic moral imagination is, well, is there any explicit law that sanctions racial inequality when it comes to the administration of criminal justice? To the extent that the answer is no to that question, then we will probably shift in our conversation to questions of individual intent or individual responsibility. Was this or that individual policeman motivated by racism? Did he or she intend by this isolated action to commit an act of prejudice? If we find that the answer to that question also seems to be no, then the anemic moral imagination is only left with one option. It must be the fault of the individual who has been arrested. There must be bad priorities in play, bad choices. If you multiply this to its logical conclusion, the anemic binary will ultimately conclude something like this when it comes to mass incarceration. Hey, the problem wouldn't exist if all of those people would just get their lives in order. This is the point at which discourse tends to dead end. After all, why should we be concerned with reforming the system when it's the individual criminals who need to change their way of life? Now, those who rightly oppose this way of thinking are easily dismissed or silenced because any objection doesn't fit into the conceptual binary. If there isn't an obvious external limit to freedom, then criminal acts must ultimately be traced to the realm of individual responsibility. Now, that's the conventional framework that I think it's helpful to label as an anemic moral imagination. And personally, I am convinced that it poses perhaps the greatest obstacle which prevents many Christians from recognizing the seriousness of this issue. What is it, though, that the anemic moral imagination primarily lacks? What's the pressure point we can lean on to expose its inadequacy? Let me suggest that what it lacks primarily, though not necessarily exclusively, is a third axis. Yes, freedom has a subject. Yes, freedom is often constrained by external limits. In addition to this, though, we must recognize that freedom has a substrate, or maybe another way of putting this would be to say that freedom has a social context. Another way to put that would be to say that freedom always lives within a context, and that context shapes its outward manifestations every bit as much as an external limit. Now, we should know this intuitively. Take two intelligent, motivated third graders. Send the first to a well-resourced school district with a low teacher-to-student ratio, consistent access to tutoring, and a stable social matrix. Now send the second to a dilapidated, overpopulated, underfunded elementary school with minimal support, with textbook shortages, all of which is enmeshed within a turbulent and volatile social context. Now, no one has issued a decree that states that the second student cannot achieve at the same level as the first. Does this mean that the difference in outcome, which is likely to ensue, is the result of the second student's bad choices or wayward priorities? Of course not. Freedom always has a substrate. It always has a context. And that substrate possesses moral significance. Our moral activity gestates, it develops, and it takes shape within a social context. And that context has to figure in the way we filter and process moral questions. Think about the land laws of ancient Israel. In an agrarian society, access to land is one's lifeline. Without it, there will likely be a downward spiral of poverty and desperation, leading to crime and vagrancy. Now, the Old Testament does include laws against crime, but it also issues decrees that regulate land access. In many ways, these laws are designed to prevent the mass accumulation of economic capital, thus protecting the poor and the vulnerable, who could easily be deprived access. In doing so, I take it to be clear that Scripture recognizes the moral significance of freedom's substrate, or its context. So with that scaffolding in place, let's turn back to this issue of mass incarceration and offer two brief claims. My first claim is that there is a sense in which mass incarceration is itself a performance of the anemic moral imagination. Because what's the typical justification cited for mass incarceration? Todd R. Clear, in his book Imprisoning Community, says that there are basically two: deterrence and incapacitation. Deterrence means if you see me be incarcerated, then you will likely weigh in sort of your moral calculus that that's not a good decision based upon risk-reward. Incapacitation means, at the very least, we can take those individual criminals and take them off the streets. Now, notice the focus on the subject of freedom there. The operative assumption seems to be, hey, if we could just get individual agents to make better choices, or at the very least, as a last resort, simply take the bad choosing individuals off of the streets, then we'd all be better off. The problem is that that is an insufficient grammar for diagnosing what's really going on. The second claim is, and this is I think where it gets most catastrophic, to the extent that the substrate of human agency is ignored, mass incarceration paradoxically produces the very social problems that it seeks to address. I want you to consider the following conceptual map, which we're going to bring up on the screen. This is what I think helps us make sense of the exponential growth of the incarceration rate, and also the way in which incarceration tends to target particular communities at an exponential rate that's disproportionate. So you can see on the left side of this map that you have a prevailing social substrate, and that's very complex, parsing why these things are that they are. But let's just assume for the sake of the conversation that we have a community that struggles with poverty, substandard access to education, inadequate economic access, that is not sufficient jobs, and social instability, that is that the social fabric itself is not well equipped to kind of maintain stability. So from that substrate, you invariably have certain kinds of criminal activity that sprout from this situation of desperation. But then the response of mass incarceration is precisely to exacerbate these pre-existing issues in the substrate. Because what happens when you take a high majority of figures out of a particular community and lock them up for, say, 5, 10, 15 years? Well, you diminish their economic opportunity, and that's putting it lightly if you think about what happens upon reentry. It fractures social bonds, right? You're taking parents out of homes, you're taking individuals out of communities. It certainly places families in a desperate condition of impoverishment, and we could multiply this over and over. But the cyclical aspect of this is that those effects themselves condition now the formation of our substrate of freedom. And so we have a feedback loop. A feedback loop which, understandably, will tend to accelerate over time. This is a downward spiral, which is the predominating reality for many communities in North America. And it is the context within which the defining inequalities of our contemporary social age take shape. In his book, again, Todd Clear puts it this way. He says, "It will be impossible to address problems of racial injustice and social inequality without first overcoming one of their main engines, concentrated incarceration." I hope it will go without saying that the solution is not and cannot be to increase incarceration rates. We must rather pursue modes of engagement that take the substrate or the context of moral agency seriously. How best to do so is another conversation entirely with its own complexities, issues like education policy, housing policy, economic structures, and so on. But for the purposes of today, I'll conclude by saying, in order to even have those conversations, Christians must first divest themselves of an anemic moral imagination.